Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November episode of Fireside Chats with the Library Company of Philadelphia. My name is Emily Guthrie, and I am librarian at the Library Company. And I'm pleased to welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Nicholas Guyot, professor in North American history at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Guyot is the author of 6 books, including his 2016 publication, Bind Us Apart: How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation, which explores the unsettling relationship between ideas of racial equality and programs for racial separation in the early American Republic. If the internet is any indication, Dr. Guyot stays very busy. In addition to writing about American history and politics for the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, The Nation magazine, and the New York Times, he is currently editing the Oxford Illustrated History of the United States, set to be published by Oxford University Press in 2023. He is also under contract with Harvard University Press for a forthcoming book about Thomas Jefferson and slavery, entitled Jefferson's Wolf, which he is co-writing with Krista Dierksheide of the University of Virginia. That book will explore Jefferson's proliferating ideas about how slavery could be ended, and will set Jefferson's watery anti-slavery thought against the backdrop of North America's transition from an imperial to a national space. Like many a good historian dad, the idea for his latest book, The Hated Cage: An American Tragedy in Britain's Most Terrifying Prison, came to him while he was on vacation with his family on England's southern shore. Having dragged his family, his words, to Dartmoor National Park, he encountered the Dartmoor Prison and the graves of 271 American prisoners of war. The book explores themes of maritime history, the history of the state, and the struggles for racial integration and race-blind citizenship in the early republic, as revealed through the stories and experiences of 6,500 American sailors in a British prison during the War of 1812. I have a feeling we are in for a fascinating talk tonight, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicholas Guyot.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Emily, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to you and also to Alison at the Library Company for putting on this talk. Welcome to Jesus College in the University of Cambridge. We are in England, so it really is 10 past midnight here. Just tell you a little about how I came to give this talk. I was doing a bunch of talks for the book when it came out in the US back in April. It was my first trip to the United States. I think it had been nearly 3 years. And I got in touch with the Library Company and said, any chance I could give a talk? And they said, maybe you could have written to us 6 months ago rather than 3 weeks before you arrived. No, how about November for a fireside chat? And I said, that would be awesome. 7 p.m. okay? They're like, yes, 7 p.m. is perfect. And then, of course, I sort of forgotten the whole time zone thing and the fact that it would be midnight here in the UK. So I feel a bit like one of those boxers that takes a lot of money to fight in Saudi Arabia, kind of line up with the US TV schedule, and they're fighting at like 4 in the morning. It's still an absolute pleasure to be here. And as Emily said, there's something very kind of serendipitous about how I came to write the book. I wasn't expecting to find this story. I wasn't expecting to kind of write this particular history next. In fact, I had another book lined up. But genuinely, I was on vacation, did that thing that we often do when we're on vacation, which is try and take our family someplace, get them interested in things that we think might be interesting. Drove to the National Park of Dartmoor, not thinking about the prison at all, and then really did kind of drive into the prison. And it was such a thrill, but also such a shock to me to find out that this had been a place where 6,500 Americans had been held during the War of 1812. So a few people have written a little bit about this story. Jeff Bolster writes about it a bit in his wonderful book, Blackjacks. Alan Taylor writes about it a little in his book about the War of 1812. But it struck me that nobody had really dug in and tried to tell the story in its kind of full craziness. So in my book, The Hated Cage, that's what I've tried to do. So tonight, I'm just going to try and give you a flavor for some of the themes behind the book. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and I will show you guys some slides. Here we go. Okay. Awesome. That's the cover of the book in the US, and you can see it strategically placed behind me on my table, along with the British version of the book. And then you can also see there the main gate at Dartmoor, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, well, on the 6th of April, 1815, around 5,000 Americans were stuck in Dartmoor Prison, a massive granite fortress which was fixed on a miserably exposed plain in southwestern England. This is what it looked like. You can see there, it's a pretty isolated locale. Virtually all of these 5,000 men were sailors who'd been captured at sea by the Royal Navy during the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 ended in February of 1815. Now, remember I said we're in April of 1815, 6th of April. But in February, the war had come to an end when Congress had ratified the Treaty of Ghent. News of that ratification had reached Britain and also reached the prisoners in Dartmoor in March, the middle of March. But 3 weeks later, on the 6th of April, 1815, the prisoners were still in the prison. The British authorities and the US government had agreed that they would postpone a kind of mass release of the prisoners until the US consul in London could arrange transit for those 5,000 Americans to get back across the Atlantic. Now, you can kind of understand for logistical reasons why that might make sense. But for the guys who've been stuck in this prison, this was a nightmare. They were, in effect, prisoners of a war which was now over, which everyone recognized had ended. Now, given that some of these men had already been in British captivity for years, their ongoing incarceration made them absolutely furious, not only with the British, but also with their own government and with the US consul in London in particular. So what happened on April the 6th? Well, it was a sunny day, very unusual for that part of the world, especially in April. The prisoners were all outside. There was some hijinks. There was a minor altercation between the prison guards and the prisoners. Now, the prison governor was an officer of the Royal Navy, a Royal Navy captain, but the guards were militiamen. So they were basically ordinary Britons who'd been kind of dragged away from whichever part of the country they were living in, turned into militia and told to go and stay in the barracks next to Dartmoor. So they actually felt kind of almost as trapped as the Americans did, these militiamen who were serving as guards. There was a standoff after this minor altercation. Kind of things got worse. The American prisoners got angrier and angrier with their captors. These British militiamen got more and more cross that the Americans wouldn't stand down. The Americans started shouting insults and kind of tearing open their shirts, kind of daring the militia to shoot. The British guards ended up losing their discipline. One shot was fired, then another shot, then another. The prisoners ran for their prison blocks, but it was turning in time, which meant that the turnkeys had already locked a lot of the prison doors. So when the men were trying to get away from the shooting, they found themselves pushing up against doors that were already locked and rushing and kind of crushing their way towards the few exits that still remained. This is what the prison looked like on the 6th of April, 1815. And if I show you here what happened, you can see in a broadside that was published back in the United States soon after this went on, giant numbers of militiamen led here by their commander. You can see this guy in the center, essentially firing at the prisoners who are begging for mercy. When the shooting was over, 9 prisoners had been killed. The youngest was 14-year-old Thomas Jackson, who was an African-American boy from New York. He was shot in the side. He lay in agony on the stone floor of the prison, just a few yards away from the safety of the prison block. And we think he was trying to get in through one of the locked doors, couldn't get through the door, tried to run through one of the open doors, but before he could get there, he was shot in the side and he bled to death. Now, the Dartmoor massacre, as it was quickly dubbed by the prisoners, produced a brief kind of diplomatic flurry as British and American officials got really worried about the potential of these killings to reopen the War of 1812, which had only just ended, right? Neither side wanted that war to begin again, and so both the British and the Americans worked quite diligently to try and sweep this massacre under the carpet. And that, in some respects, is why this is a massacre that many of you may never have heard of. So it makes for an incredible story. And today I want to give you just a kind of tiny flavor of the craziness, the kind of multiple weird, bizarre, outlandish elements that I try to write about in my book. I'll very briefly try to explain how these Americans ended up in Dartmoor. I'll try and explain why they were forgotten by history, and I'll try and give you an idea of why I think their experience still matters. So let's just start with this question of how all of these Americans wound up in this kind of theatrically scary British prison. So the first thing I should probably do is explain how Dartmoor Prison got built in the first place. Now, if I tell you that this was a purpose-built facility for prisoners of war, if you think about that for a second, you might say, why would you build a prisoner of war facility out of granite? I mean, it seems like kind of an oddly permanent material for a temporary situation, a war. Now, it's true that Britain had been more or less constantly at war throughout the 18th century, but again, a granite prison doesn't seem like a particularly big vote of confidence in your hope that this war is going to end someday. Well, the prison was mostly a product of Britain's naval supremacy. The Royal Navy had become such a formidable force in the 18th and early 19th century that Britain tended to take way more prisoners than its enemies, so than the Americans did or the French did in the Napoleonic Wars. So this meant that Britain built up a really, really big prisoner deficit. What tended to happen in the 18th century is you tried to exchange prisoners where you could. So if you had 10,000 prisoners and the French had 10,000 prisoners, you'd exchange them. If you had 10,000 French prisoners and the French had 1,000 of your prisoners, that's trickier. And you may end up deciding that you need to hold on to this differential between the number of prisoners of theirs you have and the number of their prisoners you have. So what do you do with this surplus of prisoners? Well, one thing you can do is put them in prison hulks, which is one of the things that the British end up doing. But the thing about prison hulks is they are gloomy, they are expensive, they are unsanitary. And so when Dartmoor Prison was proposed in 1805, the suggestion was that it would be a kind of healthier alternative, it'd be more modern. Again, as I said, it was purpose-built. It could be put up relatively quickly. There was lots of granite on Dartmoor that you could use to build it. Well, most of the promises that were made before the building of Dartmoor weren't really fulfilled by what went on. In fact, the prison took more than 3 years to build. It turned out to be very expensive indeed. In fact, it didn't actually open until the spring of 1809, which is when more than 5,000 French prisoners of war were marched through this gate that you can see on this slide here. So this is the main gate of the prison. Now, that winter, the winter of 1809-1810, hundreds of these French prisoners died of typhus and other diseases in the prison's hospital. So actually, if the idea that you could put this up quite cheaply, you could do it quite quickly, and that it would be healthy, a kind of more healthful alternative to the hulks, if all that was the kind of argument for building Dartmoor, by the end of the winter of 1809-1810, all of this had been blown out of the water. None of this was true. It was expensive, it was slow to build, and also French people seemed to be dying there in huge numbers. Now, in the book, I get into the really, for me, interesting question of how Dartmoor Prison, in some ways, is part of this kind of fascinating story of how Britons and Americans imagine the modern criminal prison at the beginning of the 19th century. And I have some, for me anyway, very, very interesting kind of bits in the book about Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, prison design, what prisons are supposed to be for. As I said, the kind of beginnings, the origins of the modern prison. In some ways, a prison of war is not supposed to be like a penitentiary or a criminal prison. And there's one big difference. The people in a war prison have done nothing wrong. They're merely men who found themselves on the wrong side of a war. But there are fascinating ways in which the kind of gloomy, kind of foreboding, kind of almost terrifying prison design for criminals for that period was actually transplanted into the kind of look into the aesthetic of Dartmoor. And I think you can see that slightly here, even in the gates, this kind of huge monumentalism that these French prisoners faced when they arrived in 1809. So that's how Dartmoor came to be. What about the Americans? Who were these prisoners and how did they wind up in Dartmoor? Well, if you know anything about the War of 1812, you know it was a car crash in so many ways. It was a conflict defined by misjudgments on both sides. I think it contained some of the most ignominious moments in American military history, including, of course, most notoriously, the British invasion and burning of Washington, D.C. in August of 1814. Now, one of the causes of the War of 1812 had been British interference with American shipping. Jefferson and Madison had both hoped they could remain neutral during all of the wars that were going on in Europe. But France and Britain were each kind of quite jealous when the Americans tried to trade with their opposing, antagonist in the war. This led to lots of harassment of American shipping. So you got French and British ships kind of stopping American ships who were trying to trade with the other power. Also, of course, you had the problem of impressment. That's the practice of seizing sailors from American ships and trying to put them into service in the Royal Navy. I won't get into that, but that was a huge problem throughout the 18th and early 19th century, a hangover from the colonial period, which really ate away not just at American independence, but at the safety and security of American sailors. And the numbers of people who were impressed, I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands. We're talking very, very large numbers of Americans that wound up being dragged into the Royal Navy. Well, President James Madison and his supporters insisted that the War of 1812 was a war for, as Madison put it, free trade and sailors' rights. But one really important thing about the War of 1812 is that neither Madison nor his kind of mentor and advisor, Thomas Jefferson, was actually very keen to put money into developing the US Navy. So although this was, in effect, billed as a war for sailors' rights, neither Madison nor Jefferson thought it would be a good idea to go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy by having a big, formal US Navy. Instead, Jefferson and Madison both came up with the idea that the war could be kind of privatized. So rather than having navies fight it on the American side, the plan would be to try and have privateers wage the war. And again, if you know much about this period, you'll know that privateers were basically ordinary vessels, which were kitted out with guns, which were given a license, in effect, to go off and attack British shipping for the duration of the war. Now, the decision on the part of Madison and Jefferson to wage this war effectively using civilians rather than uniformed personnel had some really important consequences for the Americans who ended up being captured on these privateering vessels and brought to Dartmoor. Rather than the British recognizing them as kind of like authentic, legitimate combatants in the war, in fact, the British saw them as mercenaries. They were given less favorable treatment than the relatively small number of serving US Navy personnel who wound up being captured. And when I say less favorable treatment, I mean they would be given less privileges in the prison. And most importantly of all, they would be pushed down the list for release. So if you're a US Navy personnel, you would effectively be able to get out first if there were any prisoner exchanges. If you're a privateersman, you'd end up right at the end of the line. So after their capture, these privateersmen came to believe that their government had put them in harm's way, but that their government wasn't now doing enough to protect them, that they had risked their lives in the war, but that the United States didn't seem to care if they spent months or even years in a British prison. So this method of kind of fighting the war using privateersmen rather than the US Navy had big impacts on the story of Americans at Dartmoor. And it began this kind of resentment within the American prisoners, not just towards Britain, but also towards their own government and its officials. Okay, well, some of the prisoners who left us journals and diaries of their experiences in Dartmoor were warning throughout the winter of 1814 to 1815 that Dartmoor was ready to explode. And when the prisoners began to vent their frustrations with the guards, the Americans were ultimately powerless to defend themselves against the shooting that incurred. That night of April the 6th, 1815, after the massacre, with the prison yards kind of soaked with American blood, one prisoner, a man called Nathaniel Pierce from Massachusetts, he wrote down in his diary his kind of fury about the massacre. And he wrote, "It's impossible for me to describe the barbarity of this. It is worse than the massacre at Boston in the year 1770. So here's my second question. The Boston Massacre obviously became an iconic event in the history of American independence. It was remembered avidly, not just during the 18th century, but then throughout the 19th, and again in the 20th through the 21st. Why didn't the Dartmoor Massacre get the same respect? Why did American historians forget about the experience and the sacrifice of these Dartmoor Americans for the better part of 2 centuries? Well, an obvious answer might be that the men in Dartmoor were lowly sorts. These are sailors who occupy a marginal place in American history in the early 19th century. They don't have much social standing in terms of their granting to claims for recognition by the general public. But you will also know, if you know anything about the Boston Massacre, that the men who got fired on in Boston in March of 1770 were also sailors. Most notably Crispus Attucks, who was a Black indigenous sailor himself, who was recovered by 19th century reformers and historians, and he became the kind of first martyr of the American Revolution in that effort to kind of recapture the Boston Massacre in 19th century American history. So I think the main reason that Dartmoor failed to get the same kind of respect from posterity is that it formed the last chapter of a very sorry and in some ways chaotic war, the War of 1812. So we remember the Boston Massacre because the American Revolution, which it kind of helped to lead to, is something we wanted to remember. The War of 1812 is something that Americans have never really been sure is worth remembering. And so the Dartmoor Massacre, despite its importance and significance, is one that didn't have a connection to a conflict that Americans registered as having the same kind of importance for their history. One of the strange things about the Dartmoor Massacre is that the men who were killed there, the 9 men who died on the 6th of April, 1815, were actually the last Americans to be killed in a war between Britain and the United States. So they were the final combatants to die in a war between the 2 countries. Now, nobody knew that back in 1815, but subsequently, as that conflict between Britain and the United States subsided, it was clear that their sacrifice was the kind of end, the kind of bookend of 50 years of conflict. It wasn't the beginning. And so for that reason, all of the events in Dartmoor, all of the incredible stuff that happened there, had a kind of disposableness. It had a sense of not really mattering to the ways in which American history was structured and the things that we felt were worth remembering. So in fact, it was Dartmoor prisoners themselves who had to lead the fight to be recognized by their government in the decades after 1815. These broadsides from 1815 itself didn't really endure. They didn't have a kind of traction in American history. So it was the families of those who had been killed, and it was the wounded and maimed prisoners themselves who argued after 1815, very often with their government, that they needed pensions, they needed recognition, that they needed some form of acknowledgement for what they had lost in the service of the United States. And unfortunately, for the decades after 1815, the US government did next to nothing to help them. There was a very small pensions fund for privateers' men, but it was so tiny that it actually went bust in the 1830s. Generally speaking, you could only access it if you had lost your life. And for those people at Dartmoor who were killed in the massacre, even they had to struggle to ensure that they had access to the fund. If you're one of the 265 or so Americans who died of typhus or who died of other illnesses in the prison, you didn't get a pension.
you didn't have access to the privateersman fund. So actually, one of the really interesting stories I try and tell in the book is that for decades after 1815, the veterans of the war actually kind of waged their own war for recognition with their government. So you had, for example, men like these, Dartmoor prisoners, here in a photo from 1851, who formed their own prisoner associations, partly to lobby Congress to try to get that recognition. You had men from Marblehead in Massachusetts presenting memorials to Congress virtually every year to see if they could get some kind of funding. They might get some land, they might get some kind of cash payment in return for what they had suffered at Dartmoor. And one of the really sad things about this for me is that these petitions, as they were submitted to Congress every year, they contain this kind of, terribly wistful recognition that the number of men who still lived, who had been in Dartmoor, was getting smaller every year. And so these memorials would say things like, there's fewer of us now, so this will be cheaper. So if you as a government are worried about the cost of paying us in our old age for our sacrifices during the war, well, there's fewer of us to pay now than there was, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And all the way through, right through the 1870s, the final one of these petitions was submitted in 1871. Congress refused to make payments to the people who had been wounded or maimed or imprisoned at Dartmoor. So that part of the story, I think, is particularly tragic. Now, if my voice holds out, and I'm sorry, I've got a cold, so I'm going to try and soldier on and get through the final part of my talk. One final reason that the Dartmoor experience was forgotten, and this is a big part of the book, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit this evening. Nearly 1,000 of the prisoners at Dartmoor were Black. And what's so fascinating about the story of these Black prisoners at Dartmoor is that actually within 6 months of the arrival of Americans at Dartmoor in the spring of 1813, the white prisoners in the prison, the white Americans, petitioned the prison authorities to ask if they could be separated from the Black American prisoners. And the British authorities granted the request. And so in October of 1813, Dartmoor became the first racially segregated prison in American history. And it just happened to be in England. It's a crazy, crazy story. But the story gets much stranger even than that. The segregation order eventually meant that these American prisoners were divided in ways that meant that the Black prisoners got their own prison block. So there were 7 prison blocks at Dartmoor, and the Black prisoners were given block 4, which was the block in the center of the prison. Now, that meant that in the evenings, the prisoners would sleep in these racially segregated spaces. So the 1,000 or so Black prisoners were in prison 4, the 5,000 or so white prisoners were in the other blocks. But during the day, the prisoners were free to move from one block to another. They could wander through the prison yards, they could visit any of the blocks. And the Black prison block, we know from the journals and the diaries that were left behind by the prisoners, became the most popular place to be, not just for Black prisoners, but for white prisoners too. One white prisoner actually wrote that there was more amusement in the Black prison than in all of the rest of the prison blocks. Prison 4, the Black prison, became a place unlike virtually any other in this historical moment, not just at Dartmoor, but anywhere in the United States. White prisoners came to the Black prison block in their hundreds during the day to patronize Black-owned prison shops, to get lessons in boxing or dancing from Black teachers, or to visit the chapel in the Black prison, which was presided over by a Black Baptist preacher from Virginia. These white prisoners would climb the stairs to get to the 3rd floor of the Black prison, where an all-Black cast would perform Romeo and Juliet, or Othello, or a bunch of kind of fashionable plays that had recently been on the London stage. And in the book, I try and speculate on some of the reasons why this very unusual dynamic could take place. And again, I get into this in the book, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about it. But one reason for this, I think, is that there were no women in the prison, and that allowed a very different dynamic to develop between black men and white men than might have developed if there had also been women. But I should also say that there was an effort to kind of blot out this history of interracial conviviality, interracial contact and exchange and leisure. There was an effort to write it out of the kind of official accounts of the prison. If you read the published accounts, the memoirs that sailors published years later, they tended to tell a story of black separatism and even of black despotism. They claimed that prison 4 was presided over by this guy on the left-hand side, a figure called King Dick, a tyrannical sailor originally from Maryland, who essentially forced everybody in prison 4 to bow down to his rule. Every other prison these white prisoners insisted was run democratically, but the black prison was run solely through force. Now, what's really interesting is if you read the accounts in journals and diaries, which were never published, a very different texture of the story comes to light. It's by no means clear that prison 4 was run autocratically. It's by no means clear that the white prison blocks were run democratically. And we know that the story of exchange between prisoners was much more kind of on a level. There was a much more genuine sharing socially. There was a much more kind of honest, if you like, or equal fraternity than the published accounts would later claim. So in the book, I try and go to some lengths to line up these sources, the kind of manuscript ones with the published ones, to try to suggest that the story of cooperation across the color line and the story of socializing across the color line was ultimately denied and was ultimately kind of buried and concealed in the published memoirs that came out in some cases decades later. So again, another reason we may not know very much about the American experience at Dartmoor is that it was a very unusual racial experiment that was then kind of disowned in storytelling in the decades after the experience in the prison. Okay, well, this brings me to the final question I wanted to answer, and this is where I'll wrap up. Why does any of this matter? Well, partly I think this is a really interesting story in American history, maritime history, racial history, stories of the state, stories of war, a story that we've largely missed. This black prison I've been talking about in the final part of my talk this evening is one of the largest self-governing black spaces outside of Africa and outside of Haiti, but it's been almost completely obscured in American history, partly because we don't have a single black source. So every source we have for what happened in this space was authored by a white person, either in a journal or diary at the time or in a published account thereafter. So I've tried to reconstruct this world in this black prison, but I've had to do so from an archive which has mostly omitted, destroyed, forgotten, or never contained experiences told by black people themselves. So as a kind of writer, and I think also if you get hold of the book as a reader, we face the same kind of challenge, which is how do we tell stories about a place where the material to tell those stories is impossible to find, or we can find it, but it tells us things that perhaps aren't really what went on in that space. So I think Dartmoor is really, really fascinating for those reasons, but it matters for a couple of other reasons too. First, I think it forces us to think about why we remember some sacrifices more than others. Now, during a war, there's a tendency on the part of the protagonists, on the part of the people who are fighting the war, people who are risking their lives or losing their lives, to imagine that their suffering and their bravery will always be remembered by their country. But I think this story demonstrates that memory is capricious, and when the state gets involved too, to sweep something under the carpet, people didn't want to remember in the American government what had gone on. They wanted the war to end. They didn't want to open it back up again. When the state's not on your side, and when the kind of currents of American racial history are not on your side too, it's extremely hard to recover and remember these sacrifices thereafter. And that's partly because, in the case of Dartmoor, the act of remembering what happened ended up becoming a critique of all of those Americans, especially in government, who were choosing not to remember. In the case of the Dartmoor veterans, what began as fury towards the British, by the 1860s was fury towards the American government, towards Congress, for not doing anything to reward or even recognize the sacrifice. So in a way, by not remembering and acknowledging what had gone on at Dartmoor, the American government made itself kind of more of a target. It sort of made it harder to tell the truth of what had happened in Dartmoor, right? Because in effect, to do so was also to acknowledge that the American government itself had played a role in kind of denying or diverting or distracting from that truth. And here's the other reason that I think Dartmoor really matters. I think it's a really interesting and maybe disconcerting reminder that the state can't and won't always solve our problems, not even problems that the state itself has made and has gotten us into. It was very weird writing the first draft of this book in the spring of 2020. You guys all remember what was happening back then. I was trying to recapture the experiences of a group of people who were confined indefinitely and who came to think that their government wasn't necessarily going to save them. The Dartmoor prisoners were brave, they were tenacious, they were supremely resourceful, but they also ended up being forgotten because it wasn't in the interest of the United States to recognize their suffering and to recognize their sacrifice. And I think that they were right for the rest of their lives to think that that was a huge injustice. For me as a historian, as a writer, by trying to remember what happened to them, I hope that this is a way to begin to correct that injustice, even after all of these years. Thank you very much, everyone. And if you have any questions, I'd be very, very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Nicholas, wow, thank you for that lively and fascinating presentation. Clearly very well researched, and thank you for pushing through a cold too.
I'm so sorry. I wouldn't like to listen to me.
You are coming through loud and clear, so I appreciate it. I'd like to remind guests that they're welcome to put their questions in the Q&A, and I will read them out loud. So while we're waiting for those questions to surface, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the 5-volume register that you worked with that recorded details about the American prisoners. I understand that you created a database or a series of spreadsheets based on transcribing those volumes. So where do those live, and how did you get access to them, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I should admit, Emily, I'm always a bit nervous about talking about my database geekery, especially in a public talk, because it's like, okay, we've gone to the talk, right, now the author is telling us that databases are interesting. But I will say in this instance, this is a really fascinating source. What I might do actually is share my screen again very briefly if I can, and just show you guys, because this is really fascinating.
Oh.
So this is the Dartmoor database, the Dartmoor Register. So what the British did in their kind of madness is they created this enormous, I mean, it really is sort of like a yard wide. It's absolutely huge. They created this enormous entry book in which they entered the details of every Dartmoor prisoner. So you can see here, I'm not sure how big your screens are, but you can see if you look very carefully that on the left-hand side there is the number. This is the very first prisoner to be brought into Dartmoor. His name was Michelle Tower. If you go across, you can see that, in his place of nativity on the right-hand side, he's from Hingham in Massachusetts. He's 37 years old. He's 5'7" and a bit. He is stout. That's the word they used to describe him. His visage and complexion, good and fresh. I can get back to that if you like. He's got brown hair, blue eyes, no marks or wounds. And on the far side, it tells us when he was released. If you look at the far left, it tells you how he got to Dartmoor. So he was impressed. So essentially he came from a Royal Navy ship and he was brought to the prison. Now, this is an incredibly unusual source. There are very, very few registers, surveys, censuses that have this kind of level of information. And what's particularly interesting is that in the complexion column, this is where you can find out whether someone is black, because the prison clerks, when you came into the prison, would write a black man, a Negro, or something similar, a man of color in that space. So we've had these registers in the National Archives in London. And when I started out this project, I thought, okay, well, I don't know anything about the black prisoners at Dartmoor. The best way I can find out about them is by transcribing the entire register. So what I did was created a database of all 6,500 entries. So I basically transcribed this into a giant Excel spreadsheet, which took me a while. It was sometimes kind of mindless work, but what it meant was that I could see something the British could never see. I could see in full detail, not only all of the people at Dartmoor, but I actually had a chance to search. So I could go off and do what we can do in a database now, which is I could look for everyone who came from Marblehead, Massachusetts, or I could look for all of the sailors who were black, or I could look for all the sailors who came on a particular ship. So I was able to tell stories about Dartmoor that the British had wanted to tell, because this giant register is a kind of database before we had the tech really to do databases. But I now have the technology just by typing in myself, actually to tell these stories that they could never tell. So I also found something kind of tragic about the way in which they wanted to see all of these individuals, to control them. But in fact, they never had the capacity to make full use of all the information they recorded. So there's something kind of wonderfully before its time about this source. And in transcribing it, I created a source that for me became the heart of the book. I knew something about every single Dartmoor prisoner. And for those 1,000 or so black prisoners, I felt like I knew quite a lot. So I've never done this kind of work before. I kind of wasn't sure about it. I wasn't sure if it would turn out, but it actually became one of the most important things about writing the book for me. And I hope it was worth it, but I would never have been able to write the book I did if I hadn't had this resource.
That must have been just fascinating. I think I would have loved to have tried something like that. I imagine there were just so many genealogical rabbit holes that you could have gone down.
I don't know about you, Emily, but I didn't really trust any research assistants, because with a research assistant they can be wonderful, but this is about transcribing.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you have to make calls on the fly about what something says or what it means. And one of the major challenges of working with the source is that complexion column will very often have the word brown. Now, if you see the word brown, you will assume that must mean a person of color. Well, actually, when these prison clerks were trying to describe appearance, they were somewhere between our more modern understanding of race. So if you say brown, you're referring to skin color. And the 18th century and before convention of thinking about the humors, so thinking about complexion as being about the 4 humors, which goes all the way back to the Greeks. So when they say brown, they just mean, this is a person with an excess of black bile or whatever. They don't mean brown at all.
Yeah.
A white person can be brown. So one of the fascinating things for me was looking through the ways that the clerks had actually gone into the register. They saw the word brown and they had clarified in pencil or in pen a Negro or a black man or a man of color. Or sometimes you'd see brown in one register, but then you would know that the prisoners had been transferred from another part of the British prison system. And in that other register, it might say a black man. Actually, I ended up going down a rabbit hole, not just of thinking about this register, but of going off and looking at all these other registers as well.
Yeah.
And since we know so little about these individuals, this was really the only way to do them justice, by kind of chasing them through this crazy kind of mountain of paper that people have looked at before, but I think no one has been this much of a geek about them before. So
it looks like some questions are popping up in the Q&A. So if okay with you, I'll go ahead and read those.
Awesome.
Oh, we have Libby Meyer. Hi, Libby. Libby asks, did you find any patterns in where the Black prisoners came from?
Well, I mean, this is such an interesting question because they came from all over. However, how do we know where they're from? Well, there's no identification. There's no passport. They might have something called a Seaman's Protection Certificate, which is something you could get from a customs house by paying 25 cents. And you could get one if you're Black or white. And funny enough, it would actually say that you're a citizen of the United States, which is kind of interesting. But you wouldn't necessarily have that or show it to the prison clerk. The clerk would say, where are you from? Well, if I were from Jamaica, would I be likely to tell the clerk in a British prison I was from Jamaica? If I was from Barbados, would I be likely to say that? If I'd escaped from slavery in Tortola, would I tell the British prison clerk where I was from? Frankly, if I'd escaped from South Carolina, would I tell that prison clerk where I was from? So actually, the majority of these Black prisoners said they were from New England and the Middle States. Almost no one said they were from Virginia. Almost no one said that they were from the Caribbean. About a dozen said they were from Africa, and there were also a number who were from India. So they were coded as Black, but they were probably South Asian. There was one Chinese prisoner who was also coded as Black, but said he was from China. There were a bunch of prisoners from what's now Colombia, who may have been dark-skinned Colombians. But I found it so interesting because while the clerks in the prison would make race, they would describe the appearance. Every prisoner would decide where they were from. So actually the register, in effect, only really tells us the place that people said they were from, the place they wanted the British to know they were from. So there's something similar going on with white people in Ireland. Like, very few people say they're from Ireland. There are a whole bunch of American sailors who are actually from Ireland. You don't go to a British prison in the War of 1812 and say, yeah, I'm from Dublin. So again, you have this fascinating way in which that register I just showed you guys seems so authoritative, right? It's like, wow, it's a government document. I can really trust this. How much of this can you trust?
Right.
How many of these stories did the prisoners have the power to tell about themselves? And the British state had no power to, arbitrate. They had no power to affirm or confirm, or it was really all down to the prisoners. So I get into this in the book, this kind of fascinating, like, how much power do you have to shape who you are, even when you're in enemy hands?
Yeah, I never would have thought of that. I guess they could choose, totally new names as well.
Well, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Many times people write in a register, this is an imposter, or this prisoner is actually someone else, or this prisoner has another name and we don't know which it is. And again, it's all self-declaration, right?
Yeah.
So one of the ways in which the prison system works is that there are some prisoners who say that a prisoner who's come in actually used to be in the Royal Navy and may have attacked American ships. And so then the British are in a situation where they're like, is that true? If that is true, do we go into the prison and get that guy out? Because the other American prisoners may end up trying to lynch them. So all of these stories you tell about yourself are incredibly hard to corroborate. And the British find themselves, in effect, having to figure out when, how, why to trust the American prisoners, because the decisions that are made about who people are, where they're from, what they've done in the war so far, could have massive consequences. I mean, someone could get killed, someone might escape, someone might help the British or be helped by the British to get out. All these things depend on storytelling. So identity as storytelling is kind of, again, in our world where all of us are fixed and we have these documents and passports and biometric this and that, and everyone's tracking you, and probably everyone logged onto this talk right now, Zoom knows where you are and what you're doing. This moment of history, it's not true. I mean, there's an attempt to identify, but people can still escape from the kind of gaze of the state. So
yeah. Oh, another question from Libby. Libby asks, apart from the petitions to Congress, were there any social or other organizations to keep Dartmoor veterans in contact?
Yeah, so the Dartmoor Prisons Association I showed you the photo from in 1851, They were one of several Dartmoor Prisoners Associations. And in the book, I talk about how they began to spring up in the 1840s. And there was this very interesting kind of dance with Congress and with kind of officialdom in the US. So, for example, when Andrew Jackson died, his big funeral procession in Philadelphia, one of the floats was Dartmoor veterans. So they were kind of wheeled out to be part of the cortege. So there was this effort by people in the government to give them some recognition, but without actually agreeing to give them the pensions that they demanded. But also, fascinatingly, the prisoner associations excluded Black people. So one of the fascinating parts of the story is that the kind of mixed race fraternity at Dartmoor didn't actually end up being reflected by the kind of social connections between sailors and veterans in the 1840s and afterwards. And in the book, I tell the story of many of the Black Dartmoor veterans who appear again kind of later in the story to ask in the 1840s for civil rights or to complain and protest against riots and kind of race riots against Black neighborhoods in Philadelphia and say, you know, we were at Dartmoor and we fought for the United States, and now there's a mob in our neighborhood raiding Black houses. How can you do this to us? So what the Dartmoor Prisoner Associations did not do was recognize and foster community across the color line. In effect, a lot like the memory of Dartmoor itself, it became whitened. And as a kind of political force, it became about white veterans, not about the mixed race community that had actually fought alongside each other and kind of toughed it out during those years in Dartmoor Prison itself.
Wow. I don't see any more questions, and I feel that we've taxed your voice enough.
I'm so sorry about the croaking. I mean, it's like, it's late here, but I hadn't expected to be this croaky.
Oh, no, it was fine. You're totally audible. So I guess we'll wrap up by saying thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And I'd like to remind the audience that next month in our December Fireside Chat, we will our guest will be Brian Lusky talking about his book called Men is Cheap: Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America, and that will take place on December 15th at 7 p.m. So Nicholas, thanks again, and can't wait to read your book.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. And good night from a very, very dark middle of the night England.
Good night.
Good night.